At Casablanca in January 1943, plans for our future conduct of the war against Hitler were developed.
Alternative missions for the Mediterranean forces were discussed by the combined chiefs of staff. One of these was to assault Sicily without delay. The other was to capture Sardinia and Corsica. The Casablanca Conference directed that the next campaign was to be the capture of Sicily. Sicily abuts both Africa and Italy so closely that it practically severs the Mediterranean, and its capture would greatly reduce the hazards of using that sea route.
With Sicily ours, the next step would be clear: to attack the enemy on the European continent itself.
Development of the Sicilian plan, assigned the code name Huskey, began in February.
North Africa became the platform from which the invasion of Europe was to be launched. Sustaining an offensive on European soil for an extended period constituted a major problem in supply. Equipment which would be needed months later had to be shipped to North Africa and prepared for use in the oncoming campaign.
We felt that some 5 or 6 divisions should be deployed in the initial landing. These forces were to attack Sicily in early July, and all preparation was based upon keeping of that target date. Study indicated the desirability of first seizing the island of Pantaloria, lying roughly between Sicily and the northeastern coast of Tunisia. It possessed an airfield which we badly needed in order to supply additional air support for the Sicilian attacks. This island was popularly known as the Gibraltar of the central Mediterranean. We believed that if the island were subjected to an intensive air bombardment, the assault would be relatively easy. In a period of 6 days and nights, approximately 5,000 tons of high explosives were dropped on the eastern portion of the island. Experienced commanders and staff officers strongly advised against attempting this operation, since any failure would have a disheartening effect on the troops to be committed against the Sicilian shore. In the actual outcome, the capture of Pantaloria was so easy that few people had any inkling of the doubts and fears that had to be overcome in launching the operation.
Come on there, check it out.
The invasion of Pantaloria proved an interesting and valuable experiment. The reduction of the island and the surrender of its garrison of 11,000 Italian soldiers marked the first time in any war that an enemy position had been overcome virtually by air bombardment alone. The underground hangars built by Mussolini's order were of little avail in the island's defense. With its airfield in our possession, we could step up air attacks on Sicily.
We further improved our air position by building a new field on the island of Gozzo, just off Malta.
The terrain at Gozzo was so difficult that there was, at first, little hope of producing a field there. This view proved unduly pessimistic.
13 days from the time the first American construction unit stepped on the island, the first fighter plane was taking off from the strip. This gave us an additional base from which to sustain our attack against Sicily.
At Malta, the Allies made final plans to invade Sicily with the American 7th and the British 8th Armies in early July.
I went to Malta a day or so before the attack was scheduled to be in position to take any action that might prove necessary.
The first major assault on the enemy on European soil was launched chiefly from North African ports. It was a vast, complex operation with 2,500 ships needed to transport the first wave of the invasion forces. Among the troops which were to lead the assault were battle-tested veterans, American GIs who had landed at Casablanca and fought their way across Africa, and British Tommies who had faced the German Africa Corps in the African Desert Campaign.
The ship convoys bringing the troops to their allotted places had to come from ports stretched throughout the length of the Mediterranean. The timing and final maneuvering of the various naval columns had to be exactly performed in the mine-filled waters.
The men were given their final briefing.
Everything was proceeding with seeming perfection.
Allied warships bombarded the invasion beaches for a number of hours.
We were using airborne troops in the operation on a much larger scale than had yet been attempted in warfare. The first troops scheduled to reach the island were these airborne contingents. In the wind and storm, it was difficult for them to keep direction.
Everybody okay?
As the paratroopers jumped high above the shores of Sicily, the high wind dispersed them and altered the course of their descent.
The parachutists landed on the southern front, although in certain instances, far from their appointed landing grounds. The weather, which in that part of the Mediterranean is normally serene in summer, began to deteriorate so badly as to threaten our ability to land. Since the wind direction was generally from the west, it was the southern beaches for which we were anxious. The eastern beaches would have the shelter of the island itself. Naval personnel has a habit of referring to wind velocity in terms of force. For me, this had to be translated into miles per hour. But I had no difficulty in realizing that force 5 was worse than force 4. The day wore on and the wind velocity increased alarmingly. There was nothing we could do but pray, desperately. We had thought it possible that the admiral in charge of the assault convoy might even postpone the transfer to small boats for several hours, hoping for better weather conditions. It was difficult to believe that landings in that area were feasible. Landings in the 45th Division sector constituted a fine exhibition of seamanship. On both flanks, the landings from the sea seemed to be proceeding well, with only moderate opposition. Up to that moment, no amphibious attack in history had approached this one in size. Along miles of coastline, there were hundreds of vessels and small boats afloat, and ant-like files of advancing troops ashore.
It was July 10th, 1943, and Allied troops were on European soil at last. The battle to the death with the Nazi war machine was about to be joined.
As battle reports began to arrive, it was evident that the enemy had been badly deceived as to the point of our attack.
During the first 2 days, against little opposition, the Allies landed 80,000 men and put ashore 300 tanks and large quantities of other mobile pieces of equipment. Our foothold was established. In command of the U.S. 7th Army was General George S. Patton, Jr., who was given the assignment following his success in North Africa.
The enemy's best formations were located largely on the western end of the island, which he had apparently believed we would select for attack. His reaction was typical. He pushed east and south to attack the American 1st Division at Gela.
The Allies dug in and waited. The German counterattack seriously threatened the Allied foothold, and Allied warships quickly went into action. For many hours, we met the enemy head-on in a bitter battle. The enemy was stopped dead. Allied troops seized the offensive and drove the Nazis back. This was but the first of many withdrawals the Nazis would be forced to make all over Europe. The vaunted Nazi Wehrmacht did not look so mighty in defeat. The Nazis' only chance to slash the Allies to pieces had been unsuccessful, and a complete Allied conquest of the island was inevitable. Equally important, the enemy's air power on Sicily was thoroughly destroyed by the Allies. Our troops moved forward in a drive to complete the conquest of the island as quickly as possible.
General Patton was a shrewd student of warfare who always clearly appreciated the value of speed in the conduct of operations. Veteran troops realized that by continuing the advance and attack against a shaken enemy, the greatest possible gains are made at minimum cost. The point the Allies wanted to capture at the earliest possible moment was Messina, the enemy port directly across the narrow strait from the Italian mainland. Mount Etna dominates the whole northeast corner of the island, and the 8th Army's route to the northward lay over a narrow road along the seaward shoulder of the mountain. General Patton, in the meantime, pushed forward to the center of the island, entering Palermo within 12 days after the initial landing. Patton's rapidity of movement broke the morale of the huge Italian garrison.
On July 22nd, Palermo was captured with little opposition. Rolling through the city on its way east toward Mount Etna, where the Nazis were making a last desperate stand, the American 7th Army was greeted by the complacent Sicilian townsfolk. General Eisenhower visited the conquered city on August 1st on a tour of inspection of the area now controlled by the Allies.
The higher commander must constantly plan as each operation progresses, so to direct his formations that success finds his troops in proper position and condition to undertake successive steps without pause. Patton employed these tactics relentlessly and thus minimized casualties.
Before completing the conquest of Sicily, Allied troops still faced some bitter fighting and some extremely rugged terrain.
In the advance eastward from Palermo, the left flank of the 7th Army, following the coastline, advanced along the rocky coastal cliffs of Sicily. The only road was of the shelf variety, a mere niche in the cliffs interrupted by numerous bridges and culverts that the enemy invariably destroyed as he drew back fighting. The advance along the coastline toward Messina by the 7th Army was a triumph of engineering and gallant infantry action.
Meanwhile, the British were assaulting the enemy on the island's eastern coast.
The British 8th Army's attack initially proceeded swiftly and quickly overran the eastern beaches, to include the Nazi port of Syracuse, most important to our supply plans. Montgomery's operations on the east coast had begun auspiciously. But by the time he was ready to assault the natural defensive barriers running from Mount Etna to the sea, the enemy had brought up too much strength. Thereafter, the northward path of the 8th Army was fully as difficult from the terrain viewpoint as was the eastward advance on the left of the 7th Army. In addition, the 8th Army had to overcome the preponderance of enemy strength. As the 7th Army approached the western slopes of the Mount Etna highlands, fighting became more and more severe.
In its path lay the peaceful little town of Troina. Troina is roughly 20 miles west of Mount Etna. The 7th Army's immediate objective lay in a narrow valley surrounded by imposing ridges. The countryside was rocky and covered with brambles, and from positions on the ridges, the defenders were ideally situated. for their guns could command every square yard of territory beneath. Mechanized units of the Seventh Army moved forward to advantageous positions in preparation for the start of the battle at Troina. As stealthily as possible, the stage was set for the attack. To the foot soldier, the terrain was about the worst encountered so far. The roads twisted through the valley, and everywhere the German guns covered them from the slopes. The job was to blast those slopes, and then to capture them one by one. The Allies were ready.
The Battle of Troina, conducted largely by the 1st Division, was one of the most fiercely fought smaller actions of the war. The enemy launched 24 separate counterattacks during the battle. The ground was rocky and broken, with hidden areas difficult to clean out. After the capture of the position, our troops were astonished to find in one small valley a field of several hundred German dead, so far uncounted. They were victims of American artillery fire.
After a week of the most savage fighting, the hungry, battle-weary American troops entered what was left of the town of Troina. They found the inhabitants, who had survived 2 days of incessant bombing and shelling, still dazed by the nightmare that was the Battle of Troina. Most of the Sicilian people were overjoyed when, on July 25th, the bombastic Duce was summarily deposed as Premier of Italy by the order of King Victor Emmanuel. The battle for Sicily ended abruptly at Messina on August 17th, with the final surrender of 135,000 Axis soldiers.
The results of the Sicilian campaign were more far-reaching than the mere capture of the enemy garrison. The Italians wanted frantically to surrender. However, they wanted the assurance that such a powerful Allied force would land on the mainland simultaneously with their surrender, that the government itself and their cities would enjoy complete protection.